The galaxy had been at war for centuries, a constant struggle that seemed never-ending. Every planet, every star system, had felt the pain of the conflict. The enemy forces, a massive empire with advanced technology and overwhelming numbers, had slowly crushed the resistance of every race in their path. Humanity had fought bravely, but their numbers were dwindling, and their fleets were becoming fewer. The last stronghold of humanity was on the edge of collapse. The enemy had surrounded the planet, their ships darkening the skies like a swarm of locusts. There was no hope left. The human commanders had given their final orders, preparing for a battle they knew they could not win. The people on the planet went about their last days, unsure of what to expect, waiting for the inevitable fall of their world. In the midst of this despair, something strange happened. No one knew exactly when or how it began, but a mysterious ship appeared in the vastness of space, cutting through the enemy lines with incredible speed. It wasn't part of any known human fleet. It wasn't even something the enemy had seen before. The ship was unlike anything the galaxy had ever encountered, sleek and dark, moving through the stars with a purpose. Its arrival was silent, almost as if it had materialized out of nowhere. For the enemy, it was as though the darkness had given birth to a new force, a force that seemed to come from nowhere, but carried a presence they could not ignore. The human fleet, already overwhelmed and on the brink of destruction, received word of this strange new arrival. At first, they couldn't believe it. How could there be another ship out there? The war had been dragging on for so long, and they had been fighting against the full force of the enemy's armada. No reinforcements were expected, and the idea of a new warship appearing was beyond belief. The commanders on the human side thought it might be a trick, a last desperate hope from a few brave soldiers who had managed to hold on. But then, the warship attacked. With precision and unmatched power, the unknown ship engaged the enemy. It didn't hesitate. It didn't wait for orders. It simply moved, its weapons firing at the enemy ships with an intensity that took them by surprise. Every shot from the warship seemed to hit its mark, tearing through the enemy's defenses as if they were made of paper. The enemy fleet, confident in their victory, started to fall back, unsure of what they were facing. They had never seen anything like it before. The ships they had considered invincible were being taken out one by one, and there was no explanation. The warship didn't just fight. It seemed to know exactly where and how to strike, outmaneuvering enemy forces with ease. On the human side, there was a flicker of hope. The crew aboard the warship was unknown to anyone. No one had seen them before, and no one knew where they had come from. The ship was unmarked, with no identifying symbols or signs of allegiance. It was as if it had appeared from the void, a force of nature in a galaxy at war. The commanders who had been overseeing the last human defenses couldn't believe their eyes. How had this ship gotten past enemy lines? What was its purpose? Was it really here to help, or was it just another unknown force in the chaos? Despite the confusion, the human soldiers quickly realized that this warship was their best chance. They rallied around the hope it provided, clinging to the belief that there might be a way to turn the tide of the war. The crew of the ship seemed to be working together effortlessly, coordinating their attacks with a level of precision that suggested they had been fighting together for years. But there was still no sign of who was leading them or what their plan was. All they could do was trust that this mysterious warship would continue to help them. Meanwhile, the enemy forces were growing more and more agitated. They had never expected a fight like this, and they didn't know how to respond. For the first time in years, they felt vulnerable. This human warship, whatever it was, had disrupted the flow of battle in ways they hadn't anticipated. But they were a powerful force, and they would not be easily beaten. As the battle raged on, the question remained, what was this warship, and what did it want? In the quiet moments after the initial skirmish, the humans aboard the warship could only wonder what had brought them here. They knew they had to keep fighting, but they didn't know how long they could keep the advantage. The crew wasn't sure how much longer the ship could withstand the pressure of the ongoing battle. but they also knew that they had to do whatever it took to survive. The war had taken everything from them, but now, for the first time in a long while, they felt a spark of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this warship could be the turning point they had been waiting for. As the silence of the battlefield grew, all eyes were on the mysterious warship. The calm before the storm had ended. The question of who was behind the ship and why it had come remained unanswered. But one thing was clear: the war had just changed forever. The enemy fleet, which had once seemed invincible, now found itself under attack from a force it didn't understand. The mysterious human warship, sleek and deadly, continued to cut through their lines with ruthless precision. Each move it made was calculated, each attack perfectly timed. The ship wasn't just fighting, it was leading the charge, like a predator hunting its prey. The enemy's once unshakable confidence began to waver as they realized they were facing an opponent unlike any other. Their ships, so advanced and so numerous, were now struggling to defend against this single warship. The enemy commanders were scrambling to understand what they were up against. Their fleet had been well coordinated, their strategies honed over years of conquest. But this warship was unpredictable. It didn't follow any of the usual patterns they had prepared for. They couldn't decipher its tactics, nor could they anticipate its next move. The once proud fleet began to falter as the warship continued its relentless assault. It was as if the human ship knew exactly where to strike, every weak point in their defense exposed in an instant. Back on the planet, the human commanders were receiving reports of the warship's success. Despite the fear and uncertainty that had plagued them for so long, there was now a glimmer of hope. The fleet that had been prepared to make its last stand now had a fighting chance. The human soldiers, watching from the ground, saw the warship's movements and felt something they hadn't felt in years: courage. It was as if the very presence of this unknown ship had breathed new life into them. But still, questions remained. Who was behind the warship? How had it gotten past the enemy's defenses? Why was it there now, of all times? The answers to these questions would have to wait. For now, the warship continued its assault, unstoppable in its mission to turn the tide of the war. It was clear that this was no ordinary ship. Every shot it fired seemed to hit its mark. Every maneuver was executed with military precision. The enemy, once so sure of their victory, were now on the defensive. The tables had turned, but no one knew how long the advantage would last. As the hours passed, the mystery of the warship deepened. The humans aboard it were as much a question as the ship itself. Were they part of a larger fleet, or was this ship alone? Where had it come from? Why had it appeared at this precise moment in time, when all seemed lost? These questions loomed over the battlefield, unanswered but persistent. The enemy forces began to regroup, realizing that they could not simply let this unknown warship continue to tear through their ranks. They started to change their tactics, coordinating their attacks to try and trap the warship. But every time they tried to corner it, the ship evaded them with an almost unnatural ease. The humans aboard the warship seemed to be one step ahead at all times, anticipating every move the enemy made. And yet, for all their success, the humans aboard the warship knew they couldn't keep this up forever. They were running out of time. Every victory, every destroyed enemy ship, was a small but significant step toward a future that had once seemed impossible. But they had no idea how much longer they could hold the upper hand. The warship was incredibly powerful, but it wasn't invincible. The enemy would eventually figure out how to counter its attacks. And even though the warship was causing chaos in the enemy ranks, it wasn't enough to completely stop them. The battle was far from over. On the human side, the commanders were doing everything they could to support the warship, sending messages of encouragement and coordinating with the forces still fighting on the ground. There was no room for hesitation now. The time for questions had passed. The warship had given them a fighting chance, but it was up to the humans to finish what had been started. Every person, every soldier, every commander understood that the future of humanity rested on the outcome of this battle. They couldn't afford to fail. As the enemy fleet regrouped and began to counterattack, the warship kept up its relentless assault. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, the humans felt like they had a chance. The tide had begun to turn, and though no one could say how it would end, the galaxy now knew that humanity was far from defeated. The unknown warship had brought hope, and with it, the possibility of victory. But the greatest test was yet to come, and the mystery surrounding the warship only deepened with every passing minute. The human warship's relentless assault continued to throw the enemy into chaos. It wasn't just its advanced weapons that made the ship so formidable. It was something more, something unseen. Every move the warship made seemed perfectly calculated, as though it anticipated the enemy's every response before they could even react. It wasn't like any battle the enemy had fought before. They had faced advanced human technology in the past, but this ship, it was different. It was as if it had been designed specifically to outsmart and outfight them at every turn. The human commanders, still in the dark about the warship's origins, could hardly believe the reports coming in. The mysterious ship had disabled multiple enemy warships with ease. It seemed unstoppable. The enemy's pride had been shattered, and their once confident fleet was retreating under the pressure. But the human commanders knew they could not rely solely on this warship forever. They had no idea where it had come from, how it had gained such power, or if it was part of a larger fleet. The questions about the warship's true purpose loomed large. For the crew of the warship, the mystery deepened with every victory. They had no idea how their ship operated like this. It was as if it had a life of its own, an intelligence that guided them through every maneuver, every attack. The ship was more than just a machine. It felt like a living entity, one that was guiding them towards something greater. The crew worked in perfect unison, responding to the ship's silent commands. They were united by a purpose they didn't fully understand, but they knew one thing for certain. They were part of something bigger than themselves. This warship had become their lifeline, their hope in the midst of a galaxy at war. As the enemy regrouped and began to counterattack, a new weapon was deployed from the depths of the warship. At first, it seemed like just another weapon in its already powerful arsenal, nothing too extraordinary. But when it was fired, everything changed. The weapon released an intense, focused beam that cut through the enemy's ships like a hot knife through butter. It was unlike any weapon the enemy had ever encountered. It didn't just destroy, it disintegrated their ships with such efficiency that they didn't even have time to react. The enemy's fleet was in total disarray. Their best warships were being torn apart, and they had no idea what to do. This new weapon was not just an added advantage, it was a game-changer. It was unlike anything in their entire arsenal. The shockwaves of the weapon's power spread through the battlefield, sending shock and fear into the hearts of the enemy commanders. They had no idea how to counter such a force, and they were beginning to question if they could win this battle at all. Back on the human side, the battle was unfolding in ways no one could have predicted. The humans had always been underestimated by the enemy, their tactics and technology seen as inferior. But now, the mysterious warship had turned the tables. Its weapon had shattered the illusion of invincibility the enemy had carried for so long. Humanity was no longer the underdog. They were a force to be reckoned with. But still, the questions remained. Where had this ship come from? What was the source of its power? Was it part of a larger fleet, or was it something entirely different? The crew of the warship felt the tension rising as the enemy adjusted their tactics, attempting to figure out how to deal with the new weapon. They were closing in, trying to learn from their earlier mistakes, but every time they thought they had the upper hand, the warship seemed to outmaneuver them. The mystery of the warship's weapon only deepened. It wasn't just that it was powerful. It was the fact that no one, not even the humans aboard the ship, fully understood how it worked. With every passing minute, the humans began to realize that the warship was not just a tool in their hands. It was something more. Something that had been brought into existence for a reason. It wasn't just their hope. It was the key to winning the war. But even as they celebrated the success of their new weapon, they knew that their victory was not guaranteed. The enemy might retreat, but they would learn from their mistakes, and the war would continue. The crew braced themselves for what would come next, knowing that the war was far from over. The warship's power had given them an edge, but at what cost? They had seen its destructive capabilities, but they hadn't yet fully understood its limits. They were about to find out just how far they could push their mysterious ally before the tide turned against them. The true nature of the warship and its purpose in the war remained a mystery, one that would take time to uncover. But one thing was clear: humanity had just received a lifeline, and they would fight to the very end to keep it. The battle reached a boiling point as the enemy regrouped, their commanders making frantic attempts to salvage what was left of their once mighty fleet. The warship, still a mystery to both sides, had proven to be an unstoppable force. But the enemy wasn't finished yet. They weren't going to let a single ship, no matter how powerful, alter the course of the war. They quickly adapted their tactics, desperate to find a way to deal with this unknown threat. The human commanders watched anxiously as the enemy forces reorganized, now deploying their heaviest ships and the most advanced weaponry they had left. The stakes had never been higher. The warship was the last hope for humanity, and if it fell, the enemy would have free rein to finish what they had started. There was no backup, no reinforcements on the way. This was the final stand. The question that now haunted the minds of the human soldiers was simple: would the warship be able to withstand the enemy's full force? On board the warship, the crew could feel the tension growing with every passing minute. The ship's systems were starting to show signs of straying. It had been pushed to its limits, and yet it continued to fight, its weapons firing with unrelenting precision. But even the mysterious warship couldn't keep up the pace forever. The enemy had regrouped and was now coming at them with everything they had, and the crew aboard the ship knew that the battle was about to take a dangerous turn. The enemy's flagship, a massive behemoth that had led countless campaigns, now moved to the front, charging at the warship with an impressive display of firepower. It wasn't just another warship. It was the symbol of the enemy's strength, their final weapon. If it fell, the morale of the enemy fleet would crumble. The commanders of the human warship could feel the weight of that knowledge pressing down on them. The pressure was overwhelming, but there was no time to hesitate. The warship's crew worked together with a single-minded focus. They had no choice but to keep fighting, to stay ahead of the enemy, even though they didn't fully understand how their ship was capable of what it was doing. The ship seemed to respond to them as if it had a mind of its own, anticipating their every command and acting before they even had a chance to speak. It was as if the ship had become an extension of their will, and the crew pushed it to its limits, knowing they had no other option. The enemy flagship launched a barrage of missiles, each one heading directly for the warship. The crew braced themselves for impact, knowing that they couldn't outrun them forever. But just as the missiles were about to strike, the warship made a sudden, unexpected maneuver, slipping through the enemy's fire with unbelievable agility. The missiles missed, and before the enemy flagship could react, the warship unleashed its most powerful weapon yet. A brilliant beam of energy erupted from the ship's core, piercing through the enemy flagship's shields and tearing through its hull. The flagship exploded in a massive burst of light, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. The enemy fleet, stunned by the loss of their most powerful ship, faltered. The command structure broke down as chaos spread throughout their ranks. For a brief moment, the battlefield fell silent. The once invincible enemy fleet was now crippled, their leadership shattered. The human commanders, who had been watching from the planet's surface, couldn't believe their eyes. They had never imagined such a victory was possible. The human warship had single-handedly taken down the enemy's flagship, and in doing so, had sent a powerful message across the battlefield. Humanity was not defeated, but the victory was bittersweet. The warship's systems were beginning to fail, the toll of the prolonged battle taking its toll on the ship. The crew could feel the strain as the ship groaned under the pressure. They knew they couldn't keep this up forever, The enemy was regrouping, and they would come back with renewed determination. The human warship had given them an advantage, but it wasn't enough to end the war just yet. The enemy fleet, still reeling from the loss of their flagship, began to regroup once again, their commanders realizing that they had to act quickly or risk losing the war. But the humans weren't going to back down now. The warship had proven that humanity was capable of fighting back, of standing up to the enemy, no matter how overwhelming the odds. The battle raged on, but the humans now had something the enemy couldn't take away: hope. As the warship continued to fire upon the enemy forces, its systems flickering and straining, the crew knew that their time was running out. But they also knew that they had achieved something no one thought possible. They had fought back against an enemy that had believed itself invincible, and they had proven that the human spirit could never be crushed. The war was far from over, but the humans now had the upper hand. The fate of the war rested on the next move. The crew of the warship, battered but determined, readied themselves for whatever came next. They had given everything they had, and now they would see if it was enough to change the course of the galaxy. The battle was about to reach its most intense point yet, and only time would tell if humanity's victory could be secured. The galaxy was in the midst of its most intense battle yet. The enemy forces, still reeling from the destruction of their flagship, had rallied in the wake of the warship's devastating attack. The tide had shifted in favor of humanity, but the outcome was still uncertain. The human warship, though formidable, was beginning to show signs of wear. Its energy reserves were running low, and the damage from the relentless battle had taken a toll on its systems. It wasn't invincible, but it had given humanity something they had almost lost: hope. The human commanders, watching from the planet's surface, knew that the enemy wasn't going to give up easily. They had seen their most powerful ship destroyed, and now they were fighting for survival. But the humans, emboldened by the warship's success, were determined to push forward. The battle had become a fight for the very future of the galaxy. On board the warship, the crew fought with everything they had left. They had been pushed to the brink, but their resolve was unwavering. The ship's systems were on the verge of collapse, but they didn't stop. The warship seemed to push back against its own limits, as if it had a will of its own, driving the crew to keep fighting. The crew worked in unison, knowing that they were all that stood between the enemy and the last hope for humanity's survival. They didn't know where the ship had come from or who had built it, but they knew one thing: it was their only chance to win this war. The enemy fleet, now more desperate than ever, moved in for a final, all-out assault. They had no choice but to throw everything they had left at the human warship. Their ships were heavily damaged, and their numbers were dwindling, but they had one last powerful weapon: a fleet of advanced drones equipped with the latest technology. These drones, capable of overwhelming the warship's defenses, were the enemy's final hope. If they could destroy the warship, the rest of the human forces would crumble, and the enemy could finish what they had started. The human warship's sensors detected the incoming drones, and the crew braced themselves for the most difficult challenge yet. The drones moved with lightning speed, their small size making them harder to target than the larger enemy ships. The warship fired its weapons, but it couldn't hit them all. The drones began to close in, their lasers slicing through the warship's shields. The crew worked frantically to counter the attack, rerouting power to shields and weapons, but the drones kept coming. Just as it seemed that the warship might be overwhelmed, something extraordinary happened. The ship's core, which had been powering the weapons and shields for the entire battle, began to glow with an unnatural light. The energy reserves, almost depleted, surged once again. The warship's systems, pushed beyond their limits, seemed to stabilize for a moment, and with a deafening roar, the ship unleashed a burst of energy that rippled through the battlefield. The drones caught in the blast were instantly destroyed, their bodies disintegrating before they even had a chance to react. The warship's weapons continued to fire, each shot hitting its mark with pinpoint precision. The enemy fleet was in full retreat. The human commanders, watching from the planet, could hardly believe their eyes. The warship had just decimated the final wave of enemy drones, and the enemy fleet was falling apart. They could see the enemy ships breaking formation, their crews scattering in panic. The battle was nearly won. But even as victory seemed within their grasp, the warship's systems were failing once again. The ship had fought beyond what anyone could have imagined, but it was running out of time. The energy core, now dimming, could not hold much longer. The crew knew they couldn't keep fighting for much longer, but they had bought enough time for the remaining human forces to launch a final offensive. The enemy, now crippled and disorganized, could not withstand a full-scale human counterattack. With the warship's final burst of energy, the enemy fleet was in full retreat. The remaining ships scattered into the depths of space, unable to continue the fight. The humans had done it. They had turned the tide of the war, and they had won. But as the warship slowly powered down, its lights dimming, the crew knew that this victory had come at a great cost. They had given everything to save humanity, and though the enemy had been defeated, the future was still uncertain. As the warship's systems failed, the crew looked at each other, silently acknowledging the sacrifice they had made. They had no idea who had sent them this warship or why it had come to their aid, but they knew that it had been the key to their victory. The ship, though damaged and near collapse, had given humanity the chance to survive. Now, with the enemy defeated, the crew could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The battle was over, but the warship's true purpose remained a mystery. As the crew disembarked, they knew they would never forget the strange, powerful vessel that had given them hope when all seemed lost. The galaxy had changed forever, and humanity had proven that it was not so easily defeated. The legacy of the warship would live on, and perhaps, in the future, humanity would discover the truth behind the ship's origins. But for now, there was peace. Humanity had survived, and the war was over.